Good morning. This is John Bushka, and I sort of want to start first of all with a little picture show. What I'm going to talk about is why I think the material in my books should be filmed and presented in a film or video series, as well as be available in books and in print, and make a brief case for it. And then we may develop that idea later. Here's sort of the outline and pictures of the parts of the story. Here's the dorm, Brown Hall, William and Mary. There's the side of Wren Hall, and that's where I met with the dean in 1961. That goes back to 1961. There's NIH, where I was an inpatient at the Clinical Center, Building 10 in 1962. There is McCollum Hall at the University of Kansas on top of Mount Oriad in Lawrence, Kansas. I think it's been torn down and replaced by a new building now. There's Strong Hall, which was the major academic building, the math department at the University of Kansas. I think it's still pretty much as it was. There's Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I went into the Army in 1968, wound up in special training after being an assistant instructor, and that was quite harrowing. There's where I lived in New York City, the cast iron building from 1974 to the end of 1978. Let me go back. There's a condo I had in Dallas in the 1980s. The last 3 years I was there at a Canterbury Crossing on Lake June Road in Pleasant Grove. Although I was in Oak Lawn earlier times. There's was Woodlawn Elementary School, which I went to as a kid in Arlington, Virginia, and since become Capitol Hospice, where my mother died December 14th, 2010, kind of the same building. That's the Army Museum at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where the public can go, because the public can't go on the military bases. It's like the Basic Combat Training Museum at Fort Jackson very easily anymore. But you can see exhibits at Fort Belvoir. And there's the Don't Ask, Don't Tell end plaque. And there's a scene from the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, that was December 2010, and that was just a few days before my mother died. So that gives you a hint at the end of the story, what that would be. And so then let me just go through. The reasoning. So why does Do Ask, Do Tell need a movie or a streaming series? And there's basically four ideas, but the biggest one, what I call the first theme, is that there are times when people with varied dispositions, but of the same biological sex, have to function well together in a closed environment. And that creates a situation of forced intimacy with others that they might not have chosen to be around on their own. And this I ran into in 1961 in the fall when I entered the College of William and Mary. It was in Brown Hall, I showed you. The same kind of idea of the sensitivities of things that can happen occurred when the debate over lifting the ban on gays in the military, which President Clinton, remember, in 1993, posed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Don't Pursue. And then there was a debate over this for 17 years until the policy was ended in 2011. And there was a law passed at the end of 2010. It was right before my mother passed away. So that's the last thing she knew that I had accomplished, where I had accomplished anything. Now, the reason it's important is that if, as far as gay people are concerned, I'm talking about gay mainly, and then stable trans adults that have actually transitioned and are medically stable, only adults. If they're excluded, then those persons don't have the opportunities to show they can pay their dues in sustaining a society that faces various kinds of challenges, war, disasters, climate change, where people have to work together and share risks and share sacrifices. They can't participate in a certain degree of mandatory shared sacrifice, and that's the way it is. Now, the second theme has a lot to do with my military service. And I was brought up in a culture that claims to be, a free country, which we thought we were a free country in the 50s, compared to the Soviet Union and compared to Nazi Germany before and many other societies in the past. But with limitations that are created by a kind of essentialist view on how individuals have to behave. Everybody is accountable the same way. They aren't divided into groups. Every individual should be judged exactly the same, and every individual has some potential obligations to others they don't have complete control over. For example, young men were subject to the military draft. Today, we're debating, I think there's a proposal to include women in the draft. Now, I think there's one that I talked about in a video recently. I don't think it's passed yet, or I don't know exactly where it is right now, but I talked about that in a recent video. If there was intrinsic, maybe a transcendent duty to protect women for childbirth, their children, it was part of this duty that men have, are bigger and stronger generally, but have an obligation to protect women who can bear children when men can't. There was just this division of responsibility that was natural. And of course, some people don't fit well into those duties individually according to their biological sex, and that's why we have a debate over gender identity. But I'll get to that in a minute. In an individualistic society, more people who are more capable or gifted have some obligations to provide for the less capable on their own volition. Otherwise, others eventually, after some number of years or decades, will have nothing to lose, and the whole political system and rule of law can break down into tribalism and then authoritarianism, and then it'll either be fascism or communism. And that's what we're seeing. The third theme is a little bit separate. Some private claim behaviors have more effect on others than we expect. That was an issue with the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, particularly with a law that was proposed in Texas that I cover in chapter 3 of the book. The fourth theme, the last one, the polarity theory that had Paul Rosenfels had developed, and then Judith Butler proposed something kind of similar with performativities a few years later. That's been turned into something today that's become a legal label, and that was never at least that was never the intention of Rosenfels, and that's not real well known. So I also presented here the two log lines. The proposed title for the film with this whole story over 60 years would be maybe with the do ask do tell prefix, but you don't have to. You must fight when you must fight is one. And be based on the first 4 chapters of the first book, with each chapter corresponding to a screenplay act. The log line would be when Bill is removed from college in 1961 for labeling himself as gay, he must assimilate to the normie world and prove he can serve in the military to preserve his own worth. Doing so would eventually involve him in a political battle over gays in the military and don't ask to tell in the 1990s, even resulting in a major consequence in his own workplace. And then I had proposed recently in Practical Screenwriting Writer's Room, and I'll mention that in just a minute. The log line for that would have been different. It says, when Bill is invited to the Science and Honor Society as a senior in high school, he must adapt to unforeseen expectations of living with other guys in a collective setting, even in dealing with his own personal limitations, before he loses his chances for a college education and a decent adult career. So at the end of this other movie, which was just based on the first chapter of the first book, the climax at the end would be that he goes back to living in a dorm after graduating, after finishing undergraduate school at home and learning some other things, becoming good at chess, making some other friends, having some other situations. He lives in a dorm again, and he's able to live in a dorm again. And so that actually represents an accomplishment relative to what had happened earlier in the story. So that second proposal is a subset of the first. By the way, template for a log line comes from a Tyler Mowry video. I can give you that in the links. From Practical Screenwriting. I belong to his writer's room. So I thought I would just mention that. Yeah, I can just show you once again. I've for showing you the books. We're talking about the first book, and then the second book is a set of essays, and the third book does go over some of the material in the first book. But I can hold them up. This is the first book, Do Ask, Do Tell, A Gay Conservative Lashes Back. And then the second one, which came in 2002, was, I don't have the copy out here. I didn't bring the right copy. So the second book is this one, When Liberty is Stressed. And it's a collection of 10 essays on liberty related topics, but it's not a story narrative. Whereas the first and third books have the third book, Speech is an Individual Right, Being Listened to is a Privilege, rehashes and brings up to date in 2014, rehashes what's in the first book, and then provides 2 short stories at the end, which themselves could be turned into Harmon story circles and adapted as movies, and then maybe joined together as a compound movie, although usually you want to write the separate stories first and show that they work. And in the example here of the first book that I showed you with the first log line, it'd be based on the first 4 chapters. Each chapter is an act of the first book, and each one would have its own Harmon circle and the climax at the end of each chapter, and then the story as a whole would have its own. And I thought I would just mention Paul Rosenfeld's. There's a DVD I have of his material that's been saved. The 9th Street Center in New York City closed in 1991, but there's been some people who've kept his works going. And there's a famous book from 1971, Homosexuality, the Psychology of the Creative Process, where he talks about the psychology of the polarity theory, where personalities are masculine or feminine, and they can also be feminine or objective. So there are 4 combinations, or the 4 temperaments. There are many monographs. There are a number of monographs, too, that he wrote that follow up on that. But the 4 temperaments were never the polarities were never intended to be legal labels that were equivalent to gender. But what's happened is that gender identity, roughly speaking, is kind of like the legal labels of gender identity is more, produces, considers legal labels that more or less correspond to the polarities or the 4 when combined with objectives and subjective, the 4 temperaments that Paul Rosenfeld had provided in the 1970s. You could make a documentary movie about that as separate from the military ban. That would be another way to do it, is to make a big video essay or even a documentary film. That's something I could certainly try to pursue. So that's what I have today, is why I think that we do need to have some sort of film or video series and not just simply books. Even though I've been under a lot of pressure, I've been involved in trying to sell the books again with a lot of different, and that's hard to do with older books. I need to write new stuff. So that's what I have today, and I do thank you for listening.